It's also an honor that this is dedicated to Lynn Baker, who was a personal friend. So this is for her. I begin with a question, or I'll turn it into a thesis, and then a statement about methodology. For the record, because we break at 11:30, I'll perhaps go till 11:15 to give a good 45 minutes for discussion, if that's all right. So the first, making a question or a statement, what I've done is I've reproduced a picture from Bertrand Russell's 1959 Wisdom of the West, which is a picture of Mount Sinai, and the caption is Mount Sinai, home of Yahweh, the invisible God of the Jews. And I want to ask a question about whether thinking about the God of theism as invisible or supernatural or non-natural is illuminating, or is it in some ways at least suggestive of the false? Suggestio falsi would be the fallacy I have in mind. Perhaps not technically wrong that God is invisible, as that might be understood under certain circumstances, but certainly misleading. I kind of came to this when I noticed that more of the critics of theism refer to God as an invisible, disembodied, supernatural person than the theists themselves, and I'll try to give some references on that. The second matter, just to begin the conference, it has to do with methodology and success in philosophy. What I'd like to do is read you these lines from John Heil from Monash University about the state of play of philosophy today. More people are engaged in publishing papers on philosophical topics today than at any other time in human history. We have record numbers of PhDs toiling on the fashionable problems, so it would be natural to expect steady progress plus the occasional breakthrough discovery. This is not how it works. However, philosophy resembles art in the sense that bad art is not art. Bad philosophy isn't philosophy. Inevitably, most philosophers aren't philosophers. This remark could seem unforgivably condescending were it not for the fact that I include myself among the ranks of philosophers who aren't. Well, what do we think of that? I'm inclined to think if he's not a philosopher, I'm definitely not a philosopher. So the ranks, that's setting things way too high. And I would say bad art is definitely art. I do some art criticism. I've never actually said this film is so derivative, it's not even a film, something like that. So I think what we are faced with is a philosophical community, both in the Anglo-American world as well as globally, where we have perhaps irreducible differences, perhaps due to methodology, and I was talking with David and Mario this morning. Even career choices can sometimes land philosophers into different camps in which they become rooted and so on. So we have a lot of diversity, but it strikes me that the fact that we disagree with each other, and I'm sure at least half of you will not agree with my thesis, but that doesn't make it not philosophy. It doesn't mean it's bad. It means that we are living right now in a place where there's no donkey's bridge. The donkey's bridge was, if you didn't get a theorem, you're an ass. This is the medieval view. We don't have that anymore, it seems to me. It seems to me that many of us can have competing views that come out as sensible. I don't know why I'm really plugging Australians today. I'm looking at one. But I'd like to put in a plug for Graham Oppy's book, Naturalism and Religion. This is in a series that I edit with Chad Meister. We're doing philosophical engagements in world religions, including naturalism and religion. We have one coming out on Sikhism, actually. We have one on Hinduism and Judaism. In any case, I'd like to read to you Graham's conclusion, because this is more the camp that I'm in. Quote, I do not claim that the case that I have set out is successful. I do not claim that anyone who fails to be persuaded by this case is irrational. While I have produced in this work, and in particular in the last chapter, is philosophy. It is a discussion of matters on which there is simply no expert consensus. So long as there are intelligent, sensitive, well-informed people who do not agree with what I have said, I have the best of reasons for supposing that the case that I have made is not successful, even though it seems entirely compelling to me. And that, my friends, is probably where we're going to come to today. I'm going to present you a philosophical methodology in making my case against using even the term or the concept of the supernatural or disembodied persons for the God of theism. Some of you will think he hasn't read enough Wittgenstein, he's Neanderthal compared to what we hold. That's probably right, but I'm going to at least try to give you one reason why a thoughtful, intelligent observer or practitioner of philosophy of religion will come to that, to the position I suggest. Given that we live in a time of irreducible plurality, what disposition should we have? It seems to me one of the most important dispositions we should have is to not treat each other's positions as caricatures. We should try to treat each other's philosophy as a kind of golden rule. I'll treat your philosophy the way I would like mine to be treated. And as such, I give a couple of examples in the handout of caricatures. And then I give some examples of caricatures which I think are illuminating. What might turn out is supernaturalism might turn out to be a caricature, but it might turn out to be illuminating. I will argue that it is not. But here are some caricatures that don't fly, in my view. Famously, Jeremy Bentham described human rights as nonsense on stilts. That seems to me unsuccessful because you can reverse it. You can say utilitarianism is nonsense on stilts. This other example, Blackburn and Parfit, I'm hesitant. I'm still going to give it, but I just heard it and I couldn't verify whether this occurred on the web anywhere. But I believe in Moscow there was a tribute to Parfit's book, and Blackburn said, "What's the difference between the 3 volumes of Parfit's work and this sack of potatoes?" The potatoes are more nutritious. And it seems to me that, again, it's humorous, but not funny, because Parfit could say, what's the difference between a bag of chips and your comments? Chips are more fun. You can easily reverse these. And I will go with one more caricature. This, again, from Blackburn. There's a long background to this, but he compares the God of theism to a cosmic teapot. And so what he writes is, I suppose trying to get out how absurd theism is. So he writes, now imagine, however, that this teapot undergoes a sea change. It's not just an ordinary teapot. Suppose it becomes an authority. Out of its spout come forth important commands and promises. Suppose it becomes a source of comfort, as earthly teapots are. But more so, suppose it becomes the focus of national identities. It is especially one of our teapots, not theirs, and so on. It answers prayers, adopts babies, consecrates marriages, and closes grief. The teapot was cracked and then rose again and is now whole. I don't know quite what drives one to that. I have a feeling it's from the old Oxford English Dictionary definition of being a theist. Do you know this one? I actually have it photocopied because it's so bizarre. Theism, a morbid condition characterized by headache, sleeplessness, and palpitation of the heart caused by excessive tea drinking. I've made it into the OED. But I want to, as we move towards supernaturalism, I want to suggest that some jibes and caricatures can be illuminating. I'm going after several against substance dualism. Now, I actually hold a form of substance dualism. I prefer to call it integrative dualism or just non-monism or pluralism. But these jibes seem interesting. Famously, Gilbert Ryle referred to dualism as believing a ghost in the machine. Wittgenstein characterizes people like me, he didn't have me in mind, but believing that there's a beetle in a box that you can't show to anybody. John Wisdom, in a response to substance dualism, he said, I don't want to have inferred friends. And Tony Flew said, I see people, not their containers. Now, while these are caricatures, I find them interesting and illuminating because you can sometimes, due to damage, brain damage or ethical failure, you can be like a ghost in the machine. You can be like an inferred friend. You aren't really a friend. What you're disposing people to believe is that you really are whom you are taken to be, but you aren't at all. Sometimes you can treat your body very distant from yourself, like it's a container. So my thought is that sometimes these caricatures can be illuminating. I would say, though, the substance dualist, such as in the version I hold, I believe that person and body, when you're healthy and ethical, you are in a functional unity. To see me is not to see a body and some ghost manipulating it, but it's to see me full stop. Okay, it's analyzable more than if we were animalists or neo-Aristotelians, but still. So I would say dualism has a more cohesive, sympathetic characterization, but these breakdowns are illuminating. Now, to get to supernaturalism and why I'm thinking of it as a suggestio falsi, there are several reasons. First, I believe those who use the term often assume that we have a problem-free understanding of what it is for the world to be independent of mind. That is, many hold Jaegwon Kim, Daniel Dennett, they assume, and sometimes argue for, the position that first and foremost we understand mind-independent reality. It's the mind that's mysterious. Let me read 3 quick quotes. One is from Jaegwon Kim. The shared project of the majority of those who have worked on the mind-body problem over the past few decades have been to find a way of accommodating the mental within a principled physicalist scheme, while at the same time preserving it as something distinctive. That is, without losing what we value or find special in our nature as creatures with minds. The next quote is from Daniel Dennett, Consciousness Explained. This is probably the most often quoted line from that book, and in most texts characterizing the state of play of materialism today. The prevailing wisdom, variously expressed and argued for, is materialism. There is only one sort of stuff, namely matter, the physical stuff of physics, chemistry, and physiology. And the mind is somehow nothing but a physical phenomenon. In short, the mind is the brain. According to materialists, we can, in principle, account for every mental phenomenon using the same physical principles, laws, and raw material that suffice to explain radioactivity, continental drift, photosynthesis, reproduction, nutrition, and growth. More recently, in the TLS, in an exchange with David Pompano, obviously this is scientific naturalism, my friends will be speaking, I think, about liberal or perhaps expansive naturalism, but these are more severe forms. Dennett writes, my behaviorism is the behaviorism of science. Meteorology is behavioristic in this sense, and so is chemistry and physics and biology and geology and astronomy. When you have achieved a theory and explain all meteorological behavior, you get to declare victory. You've finished the task because that's all there is to explain. Now, what I would say in response is that actually I think the shoe is on the other foot. What we know best is actually the mind and the mental. You can't make any sense of any of these claims without trusting mental causation, without trusting your ideas about continental drift, about your accounts of causation, about the idea of causation itself, or the idea of a physical scheme. Moreover, I believe that what Dennett, the Churchlands, and some of the others do in this kind of what we could call scientific naturalism is that they assume you can have science without scientists. there's a notion that, I want to just put forward the fact you can't, in my view, have science without having self-aware, conscious beings who are purposive, who make observations, who have experiences and are able to reason about them. I hesitate to do this, but I thought I came up with that line, science without scientists, by myself, but I didn't. I realized Ayn Rand used it years and years ago. So I guess it's the first time in public I've cited Ayn Rand, but I'll give her the credit. But if you believe in the virtue of selfishness, you're going to have to believe in selves. And you're going to have to believe in things like desires. So she, if anybody, would get on the beam here. So I adopt, you'll see I'm citing Lynn Baker here, so it's a happy coincidence that I can bring her voice to this from her book, her essay, Cognitive Suicide. She argues that science is inconceivable without mental content, and that the project of the Churchlands and Dennets of the world would be unsuccessful. So, as another kind of reference, you could think Husserl, you could think Roderick Chisholm, a lot of others, but Richard Fumerton puts it pretty explicitly, the position I adopt. We know the world of mind-independent, enduring objects only through the world of subjective and fleeting experience. Our thought of the physical is parasitic upon our thought of sensations. Now, I don't claim, even though I believe this is actually obvious, I'm not going to claim it's obvious. I will forthrightly say this would be taken to be very Cartesian, very primitive, as I joked before. From a Wittgensteinian point of view, this would be positively, weren't you awake when we went over the private language argument? Did you sleep through that one? I don't accept the private language argument, but what I want to say is that those who work with the primacy and even hegemony of the third person point of view, I don't think fully appreciate that arguably you can't have a third person point of view without a first person point of view. So I would argue for that. I come from St. Olaf College, where we have a Kierkegaard center. Maybe I've been reading a little too much Kierkegaard, but in any case, I'm definitely in the camp of subjectivity and consciousness. Well, let's go to supernaturalism and the invisible and so on. My first then worry about supernaturalism, the use of it, is that many of them assume we don't know mental causation. What are you talking about? Theism is saturated with mental content, omniscience, omnipotence, intentional activity. Whereas I would say it would be inconceivable to me, despite Alan Turing, that if somebody asks you a question, what is the smallest perfect number? And you answer 6. It's equal to the sum of its divisors, including 1 but not including itself. It's the smallest one. It seems to me that irreducibly this has to deal with the grasp of numbers and their entailment relationship. So I think people say we don't understand mental causation. Well, I think we do. We could definitely discuss this. But now, going to the notion of the invisible God, I cite A.J. Ayer here. This is in an interview with Father Copleston. Suppose I suggest there is a drogulus over there, and you say, what? And I say drogulus, and you say, what is a drogulus? Well, I say, I can't describe what a drogulus is, because it's not the sort of thing you can see or touch. It has no physical effects of any kind, but it's a disembodied being. And you say, well, how am I to tell if it's there or not? And I say, there is no way of telling. Everything's just the same if it's there or it's not there. But the fact that it's there. There's a drogulus standing right behind you, spiritually behind you. Does that make sense? It just occurs to me, I'm giving myself 20 more minutes, if that's okay. I can indulge myself for 1 second. I got into philosophy because I had 3 horrible older brothers who would absolutely manipulate me, and it was just terrible. And they used to haunt me with invisible Indians. They'd say, there's an invisible Indian over there, Charlie. I said, I don't see it. Of course you don't see it. If you saw it, it wouldn't be invisible. So I have a feeling this is a kind of a response to my... If you want an older brother, I'm happy to give them to you. So anyway, let's just canvass briefly other uses of the word invisible in the by the critics of theism. Perhaps you remember Anthony Flews' use of John Wisdom's God as an invisible gardener, or note the frequency at which David Hume uses the word, quote, invisible intelligent power, 6 times in the Natural History of Religion. Wesley Wildman is another Australian, by the way. His definition of supernaturalism is, quote, the affirmation of disembodied intentionality. And in Believing in God, Gareth Moore takes the concept of God as an invisible person, repeated in his book a dozen times, as establishing that God is like the equator, an entia rationis, that is a creature of reason. It doesn't actually exist. As a Dominican, and people are still, sadly he died very young, people are still struggling about whether this is outright anti-realism or a devout alterity. You know, God is so other, we can't speak even of the word exist with respect to God. But the notion of God being invisible is taken to place God as suspect. Well, if you're following around, I'm on page 4, a traditional Christianity, Judaism, and Islam does at points explicitly understand God as invisible. So Exodus 3:5 famously, quote, you cannot see my face, for no one can see my face and live. And in Job and in John, the Gospel, no one has seen God. Colossians, he is the image of the invisible God. And there are other verses. But we have scriptural references also to God being experienced. Think of Moses is said to have met God face to face. Interestingly enough, Spinoza said, well, Moses may have met God face to face, but Jesus met God mind to mind. That's actually one of the reasons why some had thought in Spinoza's Tractatus that Spinoza reads more like a radical Protestant than a Jew, a devout Jew, even if he had been excommunicated. For Christians, in the traditional sense, God becomes visible in Jesus of Nazareth. And you can see many cases of God as understood to be experience in the visible world, whether we're talking about William James' Varieties of Religious Experience, Rudolf Otto's The Idea of the Holy, or more recent work, like Evelyn Underhill's work. She was, interestingly enough, the first woman to ever be invited to lecture at Oxford, a towering figure in the 20th century in terms of the revival of mysticism. I suggest further that the invisibility is not traditionally thought of as a divine attribute, along with omnipotence, omniscience, perfect goodness, omnipresence, aseity, and so on. It's when invisibility is invoked theologically, this is often a matter of at least 4 things. Securing the idea of divine omnipresence. God is not a finite, circumscribable object. God's is non-contingent, unlike the visible things that we commonly see around us. God is eternal, unlike the visible temporal world. God is perhaps timelessly eternal. Also, the notion of God being invisible, I think, is sometimes invoked as a warning against idolatry. God is unlike visible idols, or to distinguish God from the mortality and decomposability of the objects around us. This is getting at, I think, something that Fiona has drawn attention to and John Cunningham, which is that often theological claims have a practical role. They're actually, I guess I'll sound Wittgensteinian for a minute, often they are part of a form of life. So we might ask ourselves, what form of life does talk of God's invisibility support? And I suggest it has some of these consequences. And I'm going to skip all this. I try to back myself up with all kinds of references, like I'm not the only one who believes this. So there are a whole host of people. In addition, I would like to propose that thinking of God, along with thinking about God as invisible, as being misleading, thinking of God as disembodied, I suggest, implies that God is in some ways impaired or injured or unnatural. or simply not natural. I'm going to claim this, that those of us who are in the theistic tradition, many of us, believe that God has a nature. None of us that I know of would refer to God as a non-natural cause. In fact, the way we think about even specific acts of God, let's say like miracles, we understand this as God acting in the world differently than the way God commonly acts. That's almost a direct quote from Aquinas' the Summa Contra Gentili. It's not at all like Hume's from the inquiry that a miracle is a violation of the laws of nature. So to say that God is a non-natural agent for a theist would be like somebody describing atheists as people who don't yet realize God exists. In other words, it's not something that any atheist would adopt. And I think, just to give some other analogies, I do environmental ethics, those people that are humanists are often called by my people, I'm from a Norwegian college, Arne Naas, he would refer to a humanist as a shallow ecologist, unlike a deep ecologist. Or think of a direct realist is sometimes called a naive realist. Well, direct realists are not going to say, yes, I'm naive and superficial. How are you? No, and so what I would suggest is the more perspicuous or fair-minded characterization of the theistic position is it's not positing something unnatural or damaged from what we typically understand in terms of causation and so on. It's actually a representation on a heightened form of the most, I would say, natural and evident kind of causation that we experience, namely mental causation. Back to that point, it seems to me you can say, I see the billiard balls moving, I can see the causation perfectly clear. Well, do we adopt a Humean model? Do we adopt covering law model? Do we go with my position, which is that causation comes from basic substances with primitive causal powers? There's obviously no consensus about what is causation. But we do know that when we think about causation, we are thinking about causation. And if this theory of causation is right, unless we go with Putnam's multiple ontologies, the other, to deny it is wrong. So I think we are very much in touch with this. So the word supernatural also historically is flawed, I believe, because in its inception, it was used to refer to the paranormal. To use some of Hobbes's terms, ghosts, fairies, goblins, elves, sprigs, sprites, I'm not sure what that is actually, nymphs, auguries. This is all straight from Hobbes's Leviathan, and also a bit of Hume. So the supernatural, actually Hobbes literally defines it as something that's contrary to reason. Now, what is the term that theists use as opposed to supernatural? Now, some theists do use the word supernatural. It's the word theism. Now, that word comes from the Cambridge Platonists. Oh my gosh, excuse me, near accident. I try to keep things interesting. You're still here. Okay. We inherit a lot of our philosophical vocabulary from the 17th century Cambridge Platonists. That's the first use of the term that I've been able to see for the term philosophy of religion. Cudworth also, I believe, there's good evidence of this, coined the word consciousness. And he also coined the word theism. And so it seems to me that this is the more perspicuous term. We forget that in the 17th century, as these terms are getting stabilized, a lot of us, or a lot of people then, were not really sure how stable English was. That's why the Novum Organon, which is a classic in English, was in Latin as well as English, because Bacon was not sure of the stability of English. So as English is getting stable, it's not supernatural, it's theism that's the one. So I guess that's a bit of a moral argument. Returning to Russell's use of the photo on Mount Sinai on the front of your handout, I suggest it would be better with the caption, "The traditional site of the Mosaic covenant." As it stands, referring to Mount Sinai as a home of an invisible God, we not only align traditional Judaism with something that appears more in line with Mount Olympus, but the picture or image of home suggests a site where one sleeps and eats and dresses. I think it would be better to represent the presence of the God of theism in terms of power, knowledge, and goodness. What it means for God to be present in the BBC studio interview with Ayer, or on Mount Sinai, or here at Heythrop, means that the existence and endurance of all that occurs or is at these sites is in virtue of the creation and sustaining by God, avoiding occasionalism and securing freedom. God knows all that is knowable at such sites, and that God can act on those sites, plus other factors. I'm just skipping ahead. So the kind of experiential awareness of God that can occur in the visible world and also can be understood as the experience of God known through the exercise of power is captured by this, could be captured by any number of things. It just happens. I have The Soul's Journey into God on my library right there while I'm preparing this handout. So I read from the 13th century mystic. Concerning the mirror of things, perceived through sensation, we can see God not only through his vestigens, but also in them, as he is in them by his essence, power, and presence. Okay, so what might be the effect of eschewing this term supernaturalism as well as disembodied in referencing the God of theism? And if we take seriously the claim that we have a more secure, clear idea of mind and the mental than we do of a mind-independent world. I think what I'm going to do, given just 5 minutes, is just in 4 minutes summarize two objections to theism and to indicate why a different framework would help us address these. So the first is by Anthony Kenny, and what he proposes is that if God is disembodied, we would have no way to attribute to God any mental content. What we can attribute to each other is in virtue of our bodily distinctness and identity. This is definitely classic Kenny in the private language argument. That's why he abandoned his pursuit of the priesthood in the Roman Catholic Church. This is in his early autobiography. My response is, if you are with me in terms of the primacy of the mental, you would be at least disposed to think that we individuate each other primarily in terms of our immediate self-awareness. I'm aware of myself as myself in being aware of anything whatsoever. If I'm in pain now, I'm aware of myself in pain. I'm aware of myself in a particular state. I don't examine bodies and then think, that thought is mine in virtue of identifying my body. It's precisely the other way around. So I would say that actually people like Moritz Schlick, Bertrand Russell, Peter Geach, also Anscombe, others who have denied that the substantivity of the self, and have done it in various ways. Moritz Schlick thought that rather than Descartes saying, I think, you should say, this thing thinks. I believe that would set off quite a conversational explicative. Like if I said, this thing wants water right now. I don't know what you would think. But I would say indexicals like that means that which a speaker is drawing attention to. Ordinarily, and in a common sense way, you understand your substantivity first and foremost, and then you understand this, that, here, there. This thing wants to speak. I would only understand is the person is experiencing some serious disassociation or is trying to be funny. The second objection is by John Hick, and he is not a naturalist, either scientific or broad. But he does raise a position that seems to me that is in keeping with the kind of position that I'm seeking to speak against. I don't seem to be speaking, I am speaking against. I'm trying to. Okay, I'm doing my best. I'll be done very soon. Some of you are praying, Jesus, take him now. Perhaps. Okay, just a little while, Lord, and I'll be on the way. Okay. In this text from the European Journal of Philosophy of Religion, Hick's target here, as often is the case, is Richard Swinburne, the God of Richard Swinburne. And he proposes that God as a disembodied person makes no sense because in order to communicate between two persons, you need a physical barrier to do so. Some kind of physical barrier. And he has a reply to it. I invite you to read this later or now, whatever. But my proposal is, again, like Kenny's position, this gives too much primacy to the physical. I don't know that I'm in communication with someone else because there's a physical barrier between myself and another person or object. I know that I'm in communication with somebody else is when I have thoughts or receive auditions and it's not from me. I would say we know when you're communicating or somebody else is attempting to communicate to you quite prior to knowing what human bodies are like. They could be porous and quite flexible. Actually, Plotinus thought bodies were like Heraclitean fluxes. You could pass through them and so on. Well, is that a priori known to be false? I don't know. I say this with some affection because I may have met Plotinus. John Finley, a very well-known great philosopher, was once introduced as the reincarnation of Plotinus, and he didn't deny it. So, so who knows, maybe I even met him. But I would say a lot of these objections, and I just pick out two almost arbitrarily, to try to get at the point that if we eschew the notion of the primacy of the physical, if we take seriously the primacy of the mental and concepts like mental causation, if we do not lean into the idea that we have this crystal clear problem-free understanding of a mind-independent world, and it's mind that's mysterious, I think that some of the objections to theism properly described can be met. Thank you very much.